I'm Dennis St. Martin with Pompe Warrior Foundation, and today we have Dr. Dom D'Agostino. He is Associate Professor at the University of South Florida. He works out of the Department of Molecular Pharmacology and Physiology while also running a research lab at the University of Southern Florida. And many, many other hats I know you wear, but hopefully I hit some of the high marks in describing you, Doctor.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much for being with us today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
First off, I know most people probably know you for the work that you do with cancer and the ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones, and I'm sure we'll touch base with that a little bit today, but I'd like to more educate the people that we're working with in our community. In our community, they're going to be very new to the ketogenic diet. So my questions will be more geared towards that direction. My first question is, how long have you been studying the ketogenic diet?
I've been studying this now for a decade, so at least 10 years. The first studies that I did was actually taking ketone molecules that you can get, from a chemical supply company and applying those ketones to neurons, to brain cells that are in a petri dish. And ultimately we started applying them to cancer cells. But what we observed was that the neurons could function better by reducing oxidative damage and making them more stress resilient. So it was obvious that the ketones were a source of energy that the brain cells can use in addition to glucose, but even without glucose, the ketones could function very well. And it would allow them to function optimally and preserve their normal functions under extreme environments. And we do work with the military undersea medicine program where we have specialized equipment where we can expose brain cells to extreme environments. So that got me interested in, exploring the use of therapeutic ketosis with a diet or supplementation for a broad range of neurological disorders.
And in the absence of glucose, the brain functions very well on ketones, correct?
Yeah, well, I would say that your body always keeps a certain level of glucose. So that's like baseline glucose. So even if we don't eat any carbohydrates, our baseline glucose level will drop. But when we break down fat for energy, the glycerol backbone of the triglyceride actually becomes glucose, and we break down some amino acids. So our glucose is significantly reduced, and there's no glucose spikes when we eat a ketogenic diet. But our body shifts over to primarily using fatty acids for fuel, which is a good thing, and also ketones for fuel, especially when it comes to brain energy metabolism, because we can mobilize fat for energy or get fat in our diet for energy, and our heart uses that well, our skeletal muscle uses fats very well, but these fats don't really readily cross over the blood-brain barrier. So our liver converts fats to small water-soluble fat breakdown products called ketone bodies. Mm-hmm. And these, like a wood chipper, they break them up into smaller molecules, and these molecules can readily cross the blood-brain barrier, and they have very important functions to preserve normal brain energy metabolism, and they also have really important signaling functions, and the signaling functions are really a big thrust of what we're studying right now.
Yeah, you're doing some very interesting stuff. I encourage anyone to look up anything that you're doing if this interests you at all. You'll find a wealth of information. Can you describe the ketogenic diet in a layman's terms?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. I would describe it, as I have to my mom a couple times,
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what kind of research do you do? And I explain it. Sometimes I re-explain it. It's a diet that is comprised primarily proportionally with more fat instead of carbohydrates. And eating a diet that is comprised mostly of fat with adequate amount of protein to prevent protein malnutrition. So we have sufficient amounts of protein for growth and repair, and a minimal amount of carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates that are consumed in the diet are mostly from a plant source, a fibrous type. And eating, it's a way of eating that shifts your body from burning glucose as its primary energy source to burning fat and ketones. So they are two fuels that the body uses very well for energy production in your brain and your heart and your muscles. And we can monitor this, by a variety of methods in the lab. We can look at O2 consumption and CO2 production, and we can get like a respiratory quotient, and that can give us kind of like a snapshot of our global physiological metabolism to show that we're burning preferentially fat for energy as opposed to carbohydrates. And when we do that, that changes our entire physiology, and it changes our brain chemistry and the way our brain functions. And that is why I'm studying it, because I'm looking at neuroprotective anti-seizure strategies and things that can stabilize normal brain energy activities, I would say, or homeostasis.
Okay. And that was much more, probably a lot better than I could do. I take it down even another level when I talk to my mom or dad about it, and I say, basically, you have a backup generator inside your body, and we just decide to use that system and as opposed to this glucose system. I mean, does that make sense at all? I mean, for as layman as it gets, I know, but
no, that's a good analogy, because our bodies contain at a maximum maybe 2,000, 2,500 calories of carbohydrates in the form of glycogen, and sugar.
Yeah.
Whereas even a lean person has 20 to 30 or even 40,000 calories in the form of fat. So, we have much more stored energy, even a relatively lean person, in the form of fat. And being on a ketogenic diet allows greater access to that fuel source.
Mm-hmm.
And it suppresses the pathways that are associated with glucose metabolism and also with glycogen synthesis. So then, it applies to a ketogenic diet will reduce the very building block that's associated with the formation of glycogen.
Yeah.
And that's a really important concept. And
it's an important concept if you have a glycogen storage disease, for sure.
Absolutely. And interestingly, it's an important concept too if you're an athlete, because if you are a fat adapted athlete, you have normal amount of carbohydrates stored in the form of glycogen. But if you're an ultra endurance runner and you're running 100 miles, since your body is fat adapted and keto adapted, it's going to preferentially use fat for fuel and actually to some extent, spare glycogen and prevent it from being broken down just because it's not accessing that there's less rebuilding and less breaking down because you shifted your body to fat burning and ketone utilization.
And you're carrying around such a bigger fuel source on your body when you use fat as opposed to the 2,500 calories that you said you carry around with carbohydrates, right? So that makes a lot of sense. You said earlier adequate protein when you were describing the ketogenic diet. Your body goes through a process of gluconeogenesis, right? And that's where you're saying your liver maintains sugar levels with the ketogenic state as well for certain organs and different things like that. If you are on a regular glucose-based diet and you overeat protein, your body just creates more sugar, right, through gluconeogenesis, and which raises your blood sugar, which then creates glycogen. Is that a true statement?
Yeah, that's a true statement. Any amino acids that your body doesn't use, they may preferentially be shuttled into gluconeogenic pathways.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fine-tuned mechanism based on things like your sympathetic nervous system, things like your physical activity. If you exercise, we generate lactate, and that lactic acid can go back to the liver and through something called the Cori cycle make glucose. So there's a lot of, a lot of people become confused if they go exercise very vigorously and they're on a ketogenic diet, their glucose can spike up, and that's because we're mobilizing glycogen and forming lactate and things like that. But generally speaking, yeah, one way to stay in ketosis, more stronger ketosis, is to moderate protein, reduce your protein to about at least about 1 gram per kilogram, or 1.5 grams per kilogram. So we want to get those ratios in the right way and kind of adjust the level of protein up and down to stimulate the body's ketone production. So if ketone production is too high, simply adding a little bit of extra protein can bring that back down. And one of the problems that people thought about with a ketogenic diet is that it would stunt a child's growth, in early development. And I think we know now that we can add more protein to prevent that from happening. So the classical ketogenic diet is 8 to 10 or 12% protein, and the modified form of the ketogenic diet is in upwards of 20% protein. Okay. And we think that dietitians that are very savvy, with administering the ketogenic diet, learn how to adjust those ratios individually for each child or adult they're working with.
And that's very important that people understand what you just said in that process, because there's a school of thought in our community that high protein is the thing we all should be doing. And there's a school of thought and there's people that are pushing protein, but people need to understand what overconsumption of protein does, especially if you have a glycogen storage disease and you're trying to mitigate the production of glycogen. So, I mean, as you said, adequate protein, we do need protein, obviously, for different aspects, but the overconsumption of protein can just be like overconsuming sugar or carbohydrates, correct?
Yeah, I think we want to match our protein requirements, with the dietary amounts. And I think that's really important. And it's almost good to start low and then add a little bit in kind of as you go. Because we know, periods of lower protein can stimulate things like autophagy and can stimulate cellular processes that may be beneficial.
I'm glad you brought up autophagy. With autophagy, I know we talked before we started this interview. I think that one of the exciting things you're doing with exogenous ketones, I think, could be applied to the other side of Pompe, which is the lysosomal part, and the activation or what this diet does and the activation of autophagy through this diet. It could really benefit someone with a lysosomal storage disease. Could you explain a little bit about that, or do you feel comfortable talking about autophagy and how it helps the lysosome?
Yeah, well, I'll explain it to the extent that we study it, and that your audience may know autophagy is kind of a big word, and even scientists are kind of unclear exactly on the pathways and things like that. But we do know autophagy, like in the simplest sense, is kind of the cell or the system tissue's ability to, I would like say, house cleaning, right? So, and it usually pertains to more in the age population. As cells become damaged, they are sort of labeled in different ways that the immune system kind of recognize them as being damaged, or they make certain proteins, or they're not functioning optimally like they should. And when we stimulate the body's autophagy processes, we actually, we actually stimulate processes that kill off those cells and break them down in ways that our healthy cells can eat the macronutrients that they're made up of. So, and it's a very fine-tuned mechanism. And if we correctly stimulate autophagy, perhaps in different periods of time, the diet does that by reducing various growth factors that are always stimulating anabolic processes. So by lowering insulin and by stimulating things like mitochondrial biogenesis, beta oxidation of fats, we can stimulate autophagy, not continuously, but in a way that makes it kind of function optimally in the background.
Yeah.
And with certain disorders, there's an impairment of autophagy. And we think periodic ketosis or ketosis with periodic calorie restriction or protein restriction, and specifically a lot of the labs studying autophagy, they feel that it's very important to periodically lower certain pathways like AMP kinase and mTOR pathways. And you can supply calories, but various amino acids sort of stimulate these pathways, we know, like leucine and other things. So if you reduce them in the diet periodically, there's different ways to do that, that can stimulate autophagy in a way and it can be therapeutic. So we are looking at this in the context of cancer to optimize a protocol that can make the patient as strong as possible, prevent muscle wasting, and allow for functional strength to continue while we manage the disease process.
Okay. I'm gonna, like I said, dumb it down again for us. But is this? Tell me if this is a accurate statement. So you said autophagy is essentially house cleaning of the cell. And if you have a lysosomal storage disease, your lysosome is stuck on a particular protein or micronutrient, whatever it might be. The autophagy system helps. So the lysosome goes around, I describe it as a Roomba, right? Goes around your cell, picks up different things, recycles them, breaks them down with different enzymes. If you have a lysosomal storage disease, your lysosome is stuck on this one particular molecule, and the autophagy process goes around and picks up those things that the lysosome cannot get to and brings it to the lysosome for degradation. I know, like you said, that this is a new process. I think the Nobel Prize in 2016 was on autophagy. So the understanding of it is fairly new, but I think the research that is out there would back up that statement. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people are looking at drugs that can do this, and we do know probably the most compelling data to point to understand the process is to look at fasting. And Walter Longo, has studied this, as many others have actually. When you go into a therapeutic fast, it is in many ways similar to going on the ketogenic diet because you suppress the hormone insulin, you lower blood glucose, and you stimulate ketone production. And we think ketones too play a role at enhancing autophagy. So that's a whole nother area of study and research going on right now. But as you mentioned, it's like the lysosomes are like little Roombas going around engulfing, they play a really important role in autophagy and house cleaning in the cell. So the idea now is to stimulate the body, the organs, the cells in a way that
to help clean.
That cleans, and we know that we can do it with calorie restriction and fasting, but we want to do it in the context of a calorie. We want to do it without necessarily restricting calories, especially in children that are in the growth phase. We want to maintain normal growth and cell repair, but at the same time, stimulate autophagy. Perhaps periodically we do it in a pulse fashion. So, and that's kind of the approach that we're doing with cancer, because we know when you stimulate autophagy, you're making your immune system more vigilant and able to recognize damaged cells. And that, can kind of play into the disease process too. When you stimulate autophagy, your immune system really becomes more vigilant in being able to identify, destroy, and clean up potentially toxic protein cells and debris in the body.
Which is a big deal if your lysosome can't do that because it's stuck on some whatever it might be, because it's lacking that enzyme to break that molecule down. So it's a very important process, wouldn't you say?
I think it's super important. And I know pharmaceutical companies are focusing on delivering that enzyme. And, I think that's going to happen. I think gene therapies and biotechnology is going to ultimately provide that, but I think our body's capacity for stimulating autophagy can be exploited and enhanced in ways that can, no doubt, help with this disease process.
And here's the thing, the gene therapy and the things that you just spoke about, I mean, you've been hearing about them for quite a while now. I mean, they could be 10 years off. The ketogenic diet you can do today, right?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. And you mentioned mTOR earlier, and mTOR is a big regulator in glucose and in growth hormone, different things like that. And mTOR prevents, along with a couple other things, but mTOR prevents autophagy from happening, right? So as long as you're running on carbohydrates and glucose, your chances of turning on the autophagic process are slim. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. And we know that certain macronutrients and even certain amino acids can, overactivate mTOR. So it needs to be appreciated when putting together a ketogenic diet to not only the macronutrient ratio, but the types of foods that, make up that macronutrients and the amino acid profile and the types of carbohydrates and, the types of protein, I think, and the types of fatty acids too, maybe might play a role. I think there are a number of drugs too that, we're working with that can stimulate pathways that can stimulate autophagy. So I think ultimately maybe a comprehensive metabolic approach would be to combine the ketogenic diet that's engineered in a particular way. And we're working on different ways to do that with or without some of these metabolic drugs that can stimulate metabolic pathways and suppress various anabolic pathways that may be suppressing autophagy. So
that seems like a very well-rounded approach to me. There's never one answer to anything, right? I mean, you have to take multiple angles to accomplish a goal. So I think that sounds very logical to me. Wish more people thought like that, but maybe we'll get there.
Well, I think things are going in that direction, hopefully things are. We know even for seizures, which I study, it's agreed upon now that you have to hit multiple, whatever disease, cancer, HIV, I mean, we're using cocktails now. So we have to, the diet is very interesting because it doesn't work through one particular mechanism like ketones. It hits no less than 12 mechanisms are activated in synchrony or synergistically, they work together. So there's multiple mechanisms: suppression of insulin, mTOR, elevation of ketones, lowering, of blood glucose, reactive oxygen species are suppressors. All these things kind of going on in the background that ultimately result in the therapeutic response. And a lot of pharmaceutical companies are even trying to find out, they have programs basically identify a druggable mechanism of the ketogenic diet. So I've actually communicated with quite a few that are trying to package the ketogenic diet in a drug because it has such remarkable therapeutic effects that have been proven. There's a list of diseases that have been proven to be therapeutic. There's emerging ones, and then there's future ones that are being studied now.
And hopefully Pompe and other glycogen storage diseases and lysosomal storage diseases are the future ones coming, and hopefully they're coming very soon.
I was going to mention that. Yeah, we want to put that high on the list. Years ago, Angelman syndrome was kind of on the list of something future, and now we did the preclinical work and published that, and now case reports have been published to where we've recently had a clinical trial that got approved for using therapeutic ketosis for Angelman syndrome, which has many different, there's seizures and motor dysfunction, and autism may be another one that showing that the ketogenic diet, is very therapeutic for many cases of autism.
Is that because, and I've read a little bit, there's a school of thought that autism might be associated with the mitochondria, and is it a mitochondrial dysfunction? And this is something I think people should know. And tell me if I'm wrong, but your mitochondria, the fuel source for your mitochondria is fat, correct? So if we're starving ourselves of fat, you're starving yourselves of the mitochondria, which then produces energy for your cell.
Well, yeah, we have sugar, glucose, and we have fat, and we have ketones, and even some amino acids. They can all sort of be used by the mitochondria, but for glucose to be used by the mitochondria, it has to be converted to pyruvate through an enzyme, pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. Interestingly, if you have PDH deficiency, a particular illness, the standard of care is like the ketogenic diet for that. So there's a number of different regulatory pathways that are impacted, whether that be PDH deficiency, the glucose transporter being deficient, that prevents the glucose really from getting to the mitochondria in the form of pyruvate. You know, Alzheimer's disease, even brain injury prevents glucose metabolism in neurons, primarily fueled by the mitochondria, whereas fat and ketones can readily cross the plasma membrane and even the mitochondrial membrane and bypasses many of these steps. So they become a fuel source that is more readily available in the context of a wide number of diseases that are associated with glucose metabolism or glucose hypometabolism. So this could be autism. Autism also has to do with the wiring of the brain. And we think, and certain things can contribute to autism spectrum disorder. And we know that there is a dysregulation sort of in the excitatory amino acids, you know, transport in the brain. And the ketogenic diet tends to just normalize brain function in a way that, you know, symptomatically tends to be therapeutic. But we also know, even if we point to Charlie Abrams, who is, you know, the Charlie Foundation is one of the key foundations that promote education and implementation of the ketogenic diet. If we point to many patients like Charlie, he used a ketogenic diet and it cured his epilepsy. Yeah. So he started the ketogenic diet, did it for a few years, weaned off of it, and he never got, you know, a seizure again. No other drug that I know of has done that. So even with drugs, when you wean off of them, a lot of times you get a rebound effect and you get more seizures. So the ketogenic diet is the only therapy that we know of right now that actually can potentially cure epilepsy. And the etiology of many forms of epilepsy is unknown. So it tends to work across many different types of seizures, independent of the etiology, which to me is really remarkable and is really drew me to the ketogenic diet as just a means to enhance, you know, brain function and cognitive function.
That's a huge statement you said about epilepsy and the ketogenic diet. That's amazing. And I know people personally that have their children that have epilepsy, and they don't know about the ketogenic diet. I mean, it's just it's insane to me that more people aren't aware of this. I want to go back to a thing you said earlier, and I just started picking up on it as you were talking. It sounds like in order for some key things in your body, your brain, your mitochondria, and a couple other things to use glucose, they have to go through a process to change that into something else. Whereas if you were running on ketones and a fat source, your body can just use it. Is that correct? So you're kind of by-stepping a process that could fail anyway?
Yeah, that's right. So there are many more steps that are potentially dysregulated. Also, that would involve converting glucose to our fuel source, ATP, through the mitochondria. Then converting a ketone body. So a ketone body can readily sort of shuttle into the mitochondria and make energy currency being ATP, right? Whereas glucose, there's many problems. Like if you have a neurological disease, in many cases, the glucose transporter is not there. Pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, which is like the rate limiting enzyme. It's like the governor of you know, fuel flow, could be deficient. And there's many different pathways that can prevent glucose, you know, from being utilized by the mitochondria, you know, via pyruvate to make energy. So that, I think that is why the ketogenic diet is so therapeutic for neurological diseases associated with impaired glucose metabolism. And that's why it's the standard of care for something like glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome or PDH syndrome. So it is, you know, it really is a standard of care for those rare metabolic inborn errors of metabolism.
So in order for your body to use glucose efficiently, it has to go through more steps, which has the potential of getting screwed up one way or another, as opposed to the ketogenic diet where your body can use it more readily without as many steps, without as many things to go potentially wrong. Is that a true statement?
Absolutely. And the glucose molecule itself may be preventing those very steps from happening. So if glucose levels are high, you can get advanced glycation end products that damage the cells and actually prevent some of these, glucose energy pathways from functioning efficiently. Wow. So high glucose levels, in your blood impair blood flow, whereas ketone levels actually stimulate an increase in adenosine, which actually expands blood vessels and increases blood flow to the brain in some areas. So a lot of the negative consequences of high glucose are actually mitigated by ketones to some extent. So, and a lot of people worry, it's probably good to mention diabetic ketoacidosis, because when we do talk about ketosis, and I often talk about ketosis to the medical students here and at medical conferences, all the hands go up. Well, what about the potential of going into ketoacidosis? So ketoacidosis is a very dangerous, potentially, life-threatening disorder specific to type 1 diabetes, which is pretty rare. So if you have type 1 diabetes, you're not making insulin. And you need to have a functioning pancreas to make insulin to really to regulate ketone production in the body, or be able to have an injectable insulin or a pump. Interestingly, my Ph.D. student, Andrew Kutnick, here, he's a type 1 diabetic with an insulin pump, and he uses the ketogenic diet to manage his type 1 diabetes, and his numbers are dramatically improved. And this is a controversial area of discussion right now, but he has such a compelling story. He was actually asked to do a TEDx talk here at the university. He'll be giving that pretty soon. And there's a whole community of people online, with hundreds of thousands of people, so type 1 diabetics, using the ketogenic diet, and it allows them to cut their insulin down to 80% of what they're using. So instead of using 40 IUs of insulin a day, they can use 4 or less, or 8, and manage their type 1 diabetes using less insulin. Now, any doctor should basically agree that if you are managing your type 1 diabetes and your glucose with less insulin, that's a positive thing. That's very good. So the biggest resistance.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The biggest resistance that you may get from the community with the ketogenic diet is ketoacidosis. And I think it's important to recognize that it's very specific to the type 1 diabetes group. And if you don't have your type 1 diabetes managed with insulin, you have runaway ketogenesis. And it's very specific for people who don't have their type 1 diabetes, managed. But if they know how to manage their type 1 diabetes and they use a ketogenic diet, that's actually optimal from our perspective. But it's very controversial, so I don't want to.
No, thank you for explaining that, because you're 100% right. That's the big thing that we run into is ketoacidosis. But I think you explained it well. If you lack the capability of creating insulin at all, or like a type 1 diabetic, that's where ketoacidosis comes into. Most of our population has the ability to regulate insulin. So ketoacidosis does not apply, is basically what you're saying, correct?
Yeah, in some cases, if the child or the adult is, has an electrolyte imbalance or is dehydrated, you may get a mild ketoacidosis, but it's quickly corrected, usually if you just rehydrate and get some food in you. But it's very rare, maybe happens occasionally with the initiation of ketosis, if it's a very restrictive ketogenic diet, but it's really rare unless you have type 1 diabetes.
Okay, I'm so glad you brought that up, honestly. I hear ketoacidosis all the time, so thank you for explaining that. That's a big thing that I didn't even think about talking about, so thank you. I don't want to keep you, I know you got other things to do in the day. I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, does this diet make sense for a control mechanism for Pompe or glycogen storage disease, if you wanted to control the production of glycogen.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a no-brainer to me, right? Because if you have a glycogen storage disease with excess glycogen, where the enzyme responsible for it being broken down is not sufficiently made, in abundance, you want to limit the very precursor that results in glycogen, storage, glucose and carbohydrates. So doing that in and of itself should have a therapeutic effect. And we know that, stimulating the body's fat burning processes through suppression of insulin, not eliminating insulin, but lowering insulin signaling, lowering mTOR signaling, all these things are also turning on autophagy that, can have a therapeutic effect. And then we can talk about the therapeutic, neuroprotective, and brain enhancing effects of elevating ketone bodies in the blood. So as an alternative form of energy, many parents have contacted me and told me that their children are scoring better on tests, standardized tests, their behavior is better, everything from epilepsy to ADHD to a number of different diseases, including autism and Angelman syndrome. So I get many emails from parents just saying that it's made a world of a difference in their child's cognitive performance or physical performance and their overall health.
Makes sense to me. I mean, you just explained if you're on a glucose, sugar-based diet, there's a lot of things that can go wrong just through the process. And if you're on a ketogenic diet, it's a much simpler process. Your body can use it easier. So therefore, less things can go wrong. So that statement makes perfect sense to me. And you just said that this is a no-brainer for someone with Pompe or another glycogen storage disease. And we talked earlier about how autophagy would be beneficial to someone with a lysosomal storage disease, which is also Pompe, but there's also another subset of about 60 other lysosomal storage diseases that I think that could be beneficial for, just because of the autophagy effect of the ketogenic diet. Lastly, is this something that you want to study in your lab?
Absolutely. Yeah, we are very interested in studying these diseases that we think are really almost like low-hanging fruit when it comes to utilizing this, underutilized metabolic therapy. And, when someone first approached me about Angelman syndrome, I didn't think, I questioned, and then we did the mouse model, and then a number of case reports came out, and it's worked better than any pharmaceutical that we know of. And from a theoretical point of view, I mean, the science, the rationale is there that this should work. And it should be done in a way, the data needs to be collected in a way that can get to the scientific and clinical community, through a well-organized clinical trial that looks at objective biomarkers.
Why do you think that no one has ever approached these diseases like this before? I mean, it is like you said, the research is there. If your blood sugar goes above 100, typically you create glycogen. As an American, your blood sugar goes, if you eat an American diet, your blood sugar goes above 100 all the time. Like, why has no one ever come up with this? Why are we the first people to bring this to anyone's attention? Do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, I do. It does come down to funding. I've visited, I'm not going to mention the pharmaceutical companies, but these are multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies, and they even recognize, like, for a disorder like glucose transporter deficiency syndrome or PDH or, Angelman's or Pompe, that the market is just not there, it's for the drug, for the substance. So they're looking at like the Alzheimer's market or even the cancer market, they're want to invest in the development of a drug specifically for that application, and are willing to fund studies for particular applications where the payoff will be that thousands, if not millions, of people will buy it.
And they can create a drug and sell it. Whereas changing your diet doesn't necessarily bring in billions of dollars. And that's why the research isn't there. And that's why we need to come up with money to fund you and the Mayo Clinic who we're working with to research this and get the word out that there is an alternative. And you don't have to fear this disease as much as you do today. At least that's what I believe. So anyway, thank you, doctor. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for your time. Like I said, I know you're a busy man and you have a great team and you guys do a lot of good things down there in Florida. And I can't wait to get you a bunch of money. So,
well, I appreciate you having me on, and thanks for your interest in our research. And we do have a great group of enthusiastic Ph.D. students, pre-medical students who I know will kind of carry the torch into the clinic. And they know that these rare diseases are really important, to develop therapies for. So I thank you for giving me a platform to speak about our research, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Yeah, it'd be great. Okay. Thank you, doctor. Have a great day.